Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1. They found the tree on a night when the town itself felt forgotten. December 17th. The kind of winter evening where the sky presses low and the cold rises straight out of the asphalt. On the far edge of Millfield, past the dead paper mill and the crooked bend in Route 32, there was a pop-up lot with more warning signs than streetlights. That was where Dennis Meacham pulled over, after driving past once then again, before the promise finally hooked him. Trees $40, any size. It was the kind of offer that didn't just look cheap, it looked wrong. And that made something deep and ancient in Dennis's brain spark with pleasure. A deal like this meant opportunity. It meant being smarter than everyone else who'd driven on by. Colleen had wanted their usual place, the neat family farm with gravel paths and handwritten tags. The one with warm cider and smiling retirees who let you wander until the right tree spoke to you. But Dennis had done the math out loud. That place charged by height. This year, he said, they didn't need cozy. They needed impressive. They needed a tree that told a story, one that said the Meachams were thriving, no matter what rumors might be floating around. No matter what Colleen's sister thought she knew. The lot itself was nothing more than churned mud wrapped in chain link fencing. Tire tracks crisscrossed the ground like scars. Maybe 30 trees total, all shoved together beneath a crooked plywood lean-to. A teenager in a thin jacket stood there scrolling on his phone, startled when Dennis's headlights cut across the fence. The look on his face said customers were rare. Maybe non-existent. Dennis stepped out first. The cold hit him hard, sharp, invasive, the kind that crawled up through your boots and settled into your knees. Colleen stayed inside with the heater blasting. Through the windshield, Dennis saw her lips moving rapidly, no doubt warning their daughter about the neighborhood, the lighting, the wisdom of stopping here at all. The kid pocketed his phone and shuffled forward. He couldn't have been more than 19. Narrow shoulders, hollow cheeks, the sort of face that looked perpetually underfed, whether it was or not. Dennis spread his hands wide, signaling size. The kid blinked, then hesitated. Something crossed his expression, not excitement exactly, but recognition. Like Dennis had just asked the one question he wasn't supposed to. Without a word, the kid led him past the smaller trees, past the respectable ones, past the 7-footers and 8-footers leaning together like they were tired of holding themselves up, all the way to the back fence. That's where it waited. Even in the dying light, it dominated the lot, 12 feet easy. The trunk thick and straight, the branches spreading outward with unnatural balance, as if shaped by intention instead of weather. It leaned against the chain link like it had simply grown tired of standing. The kid explained too quickly. Someone dropped it off yesterday, changed their mind, couldn't make it fit. The owner wanted it gone. Dennis circled the tree slowly. Every needle was dark and full, not brittle, not shedding. When he squeezed a branch, sticky resin coated his fingers, sharp and fragrant. Alive, healthy, perfect. Too perfect. For a moment, Dennis felt something else beneath the satisfaction, a flicker of unease he couldn't quite name. The tree seemed to absorb the thin light around it, casting shadows that didn't quite line up with the fence behind it. He shook the thought away. A tree was a tree. A deal was a deal. From the car, Colleen watched him nod. And somewhere deep in the frozen ground of Millfield, something old and patient settled in, finally certain it was going home. The sap clung to his skin, tacky and fragrant. It smelled exactly the way it should, bright, biting, unmistakably alive. The scent that lived somewhere deep in childhood memory, wrapped in lights and old records and December evenings. The trunk had already been trimmed flat, smooth as if prepared with care, perfectly balanced for a stand. Ready, waiting. And the price? $40. Dennis almost laughed as he peeled bills from his wallet. At the farm they loved so much, this thing would have cost 5 times that, maybe more. He nodded once, decisive, and that was when he noticed the change in the kid. The tightness drained from his shoulders. His breath came easier, like a weight had just been lifted. The kid asked softly if Dennis was sure. That should have landed wrong. It didn't. Dennis was already counting 20s. Getting the tree onto the roof was another matter entirely. The kid shoved from one side while Dennis hauled from the other, boots slipping in the mud. The thing was absurdly heavy, the kind of weight that didn't make sense for wood alone. The branches tangled and snagged, catching on themselves like they didn't want to be moved. Twice the trunk tilted, threatening to crush one of them, and both men froze, breath locked, before wrestling it upright again. By the time they tied it down, Dennis's palms were raw. Thin lines of blood ran across his knuckles, mixing with sap until his hands shone dark and sticky in the headlights. His lower back throbbed with a familiar warning, a dull, aching reminder that he wasn't built for this anymore. He ignored it. When he handed over the money, the kid stared at the bills like they were a pardon. The gratitude on his face bordered on ridiculous, like Dennis had rescued him from something instead of buying a tree. Hell of a tree, the kid muttered. He was already stepping back, already pulling out his phone, as if distance mattered. Dennis climbed into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. As they pulled away, he glanced in the mirror. The kid was still standing there. Not waving, not smiling. Just watching. The phone dangled forgotten at his side, and the look on his face wasn't relief anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, the kind of look you give when you know how a story ends but can't stop it from happening. Dennis shrugged it off. Deals made people weird. By the time they reached Sycamore Drive, the feeling had faded completely. This was home, orderly, bright, predictable. Wide lawns trimmed by professionals. Security systems that chirped politely instead of screaming. The kind of neighborhood where nothing truly bad ever happened. Getting the tree inside was chaos. Dennis and Bridget wrestled it off the roof, scraping bark against brick, needles raining down like green confetti. It barely cleared the front door. They had to twist it sideways, dragging branches across the hardwood and leaving a trail that made Colleen hiss through clenched teeth. But then it stood, anchored in its stand, bolts tight, rising floor to ceiling in the center of the living room. Colleen stopped in the doorway. Her hand flew to her mouth. Dennis felt it then, a rush so sharp and validating it stole his breath. Triumph proof. The room belonged to the tree now. It swallowed the space hole, branches spreading wide, dense and lush, blocking the trunk from view entirely. It pressed up toward the ceiling like it had always been meant to be there. This wasn't just a Christmas tree. It was the kind you saw in magazines, the kind people remember. And as the lights from the bay window caught its needles, throwing shadows that stretched too far across the walls, Dennis stood a little straighter, utterly convinced he'd made the smartest choice of the year. It was the kind of tree you usually saw in staged perfection, behind glossy glass at department stores, framed by artificial snow and magazine photos, standing tall in houses where money was never discussed because it never had to be. The kind people quietly envied. Bridget was already snapping pictures, angling her phone just right. At 17, she treated most family rituals like chores assigned by fate, but even she couldn't hide it. Her eyebrows were raised, her mouth curved despite herself. Colleen stepped closer, fingertips brushing a branch. She asked where on earth he'd found something like this. Dennis told the story again. Route 32, the muddy lot, the tree that didn't fit in someone else's house. When he said the price out loud, he watched her face change. Not surprise. Relief. It was subtle, but he saw it. The softening around her eyes. The quiet recalculation. The unspoken thought that maybe things were still okay. That maybe he still had this. That the changes at work didn't mean what she'd feared they meant. She smiled at him. Not the polite smile she wore around his coworkers. Not the practiced one she used in public. The real one. The one he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. They spent the rest of the evening with the tree. Dennis handled the lights, 6 full strands of warm white, the good ones he'd splurged on because cheap lights always failed when you needed them most. Colleen and Bridget unwrapped ornaments, layer by layer, year by year. Their first Christmas together. The soft felt animals from Bridget's kindergarten phase. The heavy glass pieces Dennis's mother mailed every December with a neat card reminding them she still existed and expected visits. By the time they finished, the clock crept past 11. The tree stood transformed, radiant and commanding, filling the room with reflected light. It looked like proof of taste, of effort, of a life that had stayed intact. Dennis shut off the other lights. They stood there together in the glow, the 3 of them, quiet and still. No one rushed to speak. Nothing needed explaining. The tree did all the talking. Bridget finally broke the silence, announcing she was posting the photos because her aunt was going to freak out. Colleen corrected her language out of habit, but she was laughing when she did it. Later in bed, Dennis lay on his back, hands folded over his chest, steeped in satisfaction. The kind that settles deep and warm. The house below hummed softly, the tree still lit, its glow seeping under the bedroom door. The air smelled like pine and cinnamon, like the holidays were supposed to smell. Colleen slept facing away from him, breathing slow and even. Dennis closed his eyes and rehearsed the story. How he'd tell it at work, how he'd mention the height casually, how he'd say the price like it was an afterthought, the tone of a man who recognized value when it presented itself. He didn't notice the smell then. That came later. It started on the 19th, 2 days after they brought the tree home. After they brought the tree home, Dennis came downstairs for his morning coffee and stopped short in the kitchen doorway, his brow furrowed. The house felt different, not dirty, not foul, just wrong. There was a sweetness in the air, heavy and ripe, like something left out too long. Beneath it lingered another note, thin but sharp, that made his nose twitch in instinctive rejection. He called upstairs, asking Colleen if she smelled it. She came down a few minutes later, already dressed for work, hair pulled back, scrubs crisp. She paused, inhaled, and shook her head. Nothing. Dennis led her into the living room. The tree stood exactly where they'd left it, flawless in the morning sun. Ornaments caught the light and scattered faint rainbows across the walls, but up close there was no mistaking it now. The scent had thickened. Sweet, yes, but spoiled. Like fruit just past its last good day. Colleen leaned in and finally caught it. She waved a hand dismissively and said it was probably sap warming up. Trees did that sometimes. The heat pulled it out. Dennis mentioned the thermostat, 72, same as always. Should he turn it down? She looked at him like he was joking. It was December. She wasn't freezing, so a tree could smell nicer. She glanced at her watch, already late, and told him to water it. Trees smelled when they were thirsty. So he did. The stand swallowed water greedily, nearly an entire pitcher before the level touched the trunk. That was a good sign, he told himself. It meant the tree was alive, healthy, drinking. He stepped back, hands on his hips, waiting for reassurance to arrive. It didn't. By the 21st, the smell had worsened. Not enough to force action, but enough to gnaw at him. It followed him through the room, caught in his throat. Sweetness layered over something dense and organic. Something that stirred a memory he didn't want to unpack, of tearing open walls in an old apartment, searching for a small dead thing they could smell but couldn't find. Bridget stood in the doorway one afternoon, nose pinched tight, announcing that it was gross, that it smelled like something had died. Dennis shut that down too fast, said it wasn't that bad, said she was exaggerating. She gagged to make her point. Colleen returned from the kitchen holding a can of air freshener. She'd already sprayed the room twice that morning. Now the air was a sick blend of overripe sweetness and artificial lavender, a combination that somehow made everything worse. Dennis stood there, staring at the tree as its lights blinked softly, and told himself, again, that this was normal. Trees did this sometimes. They just needed time. Somehow, that was worse than the rot on its own. Colleen said it again, calm and practiced, like repeating a diagnosis she'd already explained. Sap did this sometimes. Heat changed it, broke it down. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't dangerous. When Bridget suggested, carefully, that maybe they should take the tree down, Dennis snapped before he meant to. The edge in his voice surprised even him. It was 4 days before Christmas. They were not taking it down. Not now. Bridget tried to argue. Dennis shut it down immediately. It was fine. Her mother was dealing with it. Colleen sprayed the tree again. Dennis watched Bridget's jaw tighten, the way it always did when she knew pushing back would only make things worse. She learned that trick from Colleen, how to lose an argument without ever speaking it out loud. The silent version, the one that lingered. Dennis felt irritation spark at both of them, at the looks they exchanged, at the way they could conduct an entire disagreement without including him. Bridget left. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her bedroom door close a beat too hard to be accidental. Colleen spoke quietly then, said Bridget wasn't wrong, said the smell was getting worse. Dennis said it would be fine. She started to say his name. That tone, the one that meant a hard truth was coming, but he cut her off. 4 days, he said. Just 4 days. Can we not have one Christmas that goes right? She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something heavier, worn thin. Then she set the can down on the coffee table and went upstairs without another word. Dennis stood alone in the living room with the tree. He stepped closer, leaning in, trying to isolate it. The base, the lower branches, the trunk, but the smell wasn't coming from one place. It soaked the whole thing, saturated it. Up close, it was nearly unbearable. Sweet decay, thick and cloying, and underneath it, clear now, undeniable, something his mind had been refusing to label. It smelled like meat. Not fresh, not cooked, old meat, forgotten meat. The kind left out too long, the kind you recognize on instinct before thought can catch up. His stomach rolled. He stepped back fast. Sap, he told himself, just sap. Heat did strange things. Trees were organic. Organic things broke down. That was normal. That was science. He went to the kitchen and dug under the sink until he found the plugins. The automatic ones. Reliable. Aggressive. He placed 4 of them around the living room, 1 in each corner. When he finished, the air was unbearable. Rot layered with artificial pine. Sweet chemicals, fake flowers, something tropical that had no place in December. His eyes burned, his throat tight. Better, he told himself. This is better. On the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Dennis woke at exactly 3:00 a.m., heart racing, breath shallow, with no idea what had pulled him from sleep. The bedroom was completely dark. He woke to silence so complete it rang in his ears. The house held its breath. The only sound was the furnace clicking on somewhere below, a low mechanical heartbeat. Colleen slept beside him, turned away, her breathing deep and even. Dennis stared at the ceiling, confused by the sudden alertness in his body, the sense that something was wrong even before his mind could name it. Then it reached him. The smell. It had climbed upstairs. Not drifting, invading, pushing up through the floor, filling the bedroom with that same sickly sweetness, thicker now, heavier. Dennis swallowed and tasted it, felt it coat the back of his throat. His stomach tightened in protest. He eased out of bed, slow and careful, pulling on nothing but a t-shirt and boxers, afraid that even the smallest sound might wake her. He moved down the stairs barefoot. The living room glowed. They left the lights on again. Colleen liked the way the tree looked from outside, liked the idea of it announcing itself to the street. In the colored haze, the room felt altered, stretched, unfamiliar. Furniture cast long, warped shadows. The tree towered in the corner, lights blinking softly, too softly like it was breathing. The smell down here was unbearable. Dennis covered his mouth and nose and forced himself closer. His eyes watered. He could see the change now. The needles weren't right. The deep green had dulled, the tips darkening, curling inward like they were retreating from the air. He reached out. The bark didn't feel solid. It yielded slightly under his fingers, spongy in a way wood should never be. Dennis jerked his hand back, heart hammering. This wasn't sap. This wasn't heat. Something was rotting. Standing there in the glow of blinking lights, Dennis's mind raced backward. The muddy lot, the kid's face, the hesitation, the question, "Are you sure?" The story about someone returning it because it didn't fit. The price that had felt like a victory. $40. He thought about how nothing came free, how every bargain collected its debt eventually, how he should have known, how he did know, somewhere deep down, and chose not to listen. Dennis. Colleen's voice floated down the stairwell, thick with nausea. He hurried back upstairs. She was sitting upright in bed, one hand pressed to her stomach, skin pale in the dim light. She said the smell had woken her, said she thought she was going to be sick. She barely made it to the bathroom. Dennis stood in the hallway listening, retching, the sharp splash of water, the toilet flushing. When she came back, her eyes were glassy, her face drained of color. "It has to go," she said, no softness left. "I mean it, it's making me sick." "Tomorrow," Dennis said quickly. "I'll take it out tomorrow." She stared at him. "Why not now?" "It's 3 a.m. "I don't care." He cut her off before she could finish. "Tomorrow," he repeated, louder than he meant to. They'd take it out tomorrow. They'd figure something out. They'd still have Christmas. The words sounded thin even to him. And as he lay back down beside her, the smell lingering in the sheets, Dennis wondered, for the first time, if the house would let them wait that long. She held his gaze for a long, quiet stretch. Then she turned away, pulled the blanket tight to her chin, and faced the wall. Dennis lay beside her, staring into the dark, listening to her breathing. It was steady, but wrong, too controlled. He knew she wasn't asleep. He knew she was lying there cataloging the smell, the tree, the way he'd refused to back down, wondering what kind of man doubled down instead of admitting he'd been wrong. The kind who chased bargains from questionable places, the kind who always needed to win. Sleep never came. On the morning of December 24th, Dennis called in sick. The words felt strange in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done it. Maybe a decade ago, maybe longer. His boss sounded surprised, mildly let down. Dennis hung up with the uneasy sense that something had been marked down somewhere, some invisible tally updated. To hell with it, he thought. To hell with work, with Christmas, with the tree. And still, he didn't take it out. Because it was Christmas Eve, and because Janet was coming at 6. Janet with her immaculate home and polished smile. Janet, whose husband never seemed tired and whose kids wore blazers and talked about college like it was inevitable. Dennis imagined her stepping into the living room, eyes flicking immediately to the empty corner, the quiet judgment settling in. He would not give her that. He would rather endure the smell. So he opened every window, cold be damned. The furnace roared as heat poured uselessly into the winter air. He sprayed more scent until his head ached. He lit candles, spice, pine, vague seasonal promises that smelled more like chemicals than comfort. Slowly, grudgingly, the air shifted. The rot didn't vanish, but it retreated, buried beneath layers of artificial cheer. It became something you could almost ignore. Almost. Bridget came downstairs around noon. She took in the open windows, the flickering candles, her father standing guard like a man defending a bad decision. She said this was insane. Dennis said it was handled. She said it smelled like death. He snapped back that the tree was drying out. When she told him, flatly, to take it down, he said after dinner, after Janet left. Bridget didn't argue. She just shook her head and disappeared into the kitchen. Dennis caught fragments of hushed voices, mother and daughter speaking in tones meant to exclude him. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew their shape. He stayed in the living room with the tree, with the windows open, with the smell fighting to surface. And he told himself again and again that he was in control, that he was managing it, that everything was fine. By mid-afternoon, the air turned on him. Not slowly, not in a way he could adjust to. It came in surges, sudden spikes so violent they made his eyes water and his stomach lurch, then pulled back just enough to give him hope before crashing again. The kind of rhythm that wears you down. By 4, every spray bottle was empty. By 5, every candle in the house was burning, flames flickering like they were fighting for their lives. And still the odor pushed through it all, thick, biological, unmistakably wrong. In the kitchen, Colleen worked in silence. She moved through the motions of a dish she'd made every Christmas Eve for as long as Dennis could remember. Same steps, same ingredients, but her shoulders were rigid, her movements clipped. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward the living room, like she was bracing for impact. At 5:45, Bridget came downstairs. She'd worn the sweater her mother bought just for tonight, deep red, winter pattern. She'd even put on makeup, which told Dennis everything he needed to know. She was trying for him. The swell of love that hit him was almost painful. "You look beautiful," he said. She smiled, small but sincere. He promised her quietly that the tree would be gone first thing in the morning, that this would end. She said okay, added that she knew he should have taken it out already. He started to defend himself, but she squeezed his arm, told him it was fine, that they just needed to get through tonight. At exactly 6, the doorbell rang. Of course it did. Janet never ran late, not to dinners, not to life. She stood on the porch with her flawless posture, her husband beside her, confident, effortless, and their 2 boys dressed like they belonged somewhere far more expensive than this house. Dennis opened the door. Janet's face changed instantly. Her nose twitched, her eyes flicked sideways to her husband. Dennis felt it like a slap. "Merry Christmas," he said too loudly. They stepped inside. The boys headed straight for the living room, drawn by the lights, the height, the promise of something magical. Kids always went to the tree first. Their excitement didn't last. The younger one clamped a hand over his nose. The older stopped short and asked what that smell was. Dennis answered too quickly, said it was sap, said heat did weird things, said it was normal. Janet didn't move past the entryway. She kept her coat on, her purse pressed tight to her chest like armor. She said the smell was strong. Dennis insisted it was already improving, pointed out the open windows, the candles. Her husband spoke up, casual and honest. Smelled like something had died. He wasn't wrong. Dennis knew that, felt it, but the urge to hit him came anyway, hot and immediate. Colleen appeared then, smile fixed in place like a mask applied seconds too late. "Come in," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." Dennis stood between the tree and the door, the rot and the judgment breathing through his mouth, telling himself the same lie one more time. Just tonight. Just get through tonight. Almost ready. They shut themselves into the dining room like it was a lifeboat. Dennis closed the living room door and killed the tree lights so no glow leaked through the glass panes. Out of sight, out of mind. For a little while, it worked. Dinner settled into something close to normal. The food tasted right. Bridget told a story that actually made Janet laugh. The boys behaved. Dennis poured wine and drank it too quickly, warmth spreading through his chest, hope sneaking back in where it didn't belong. For maybe 30 minutes, he believed they might survive this. Then one of the boys, Carson, one of them, asked if he could see the tree up close. Colleen said maybe later, after dinner. The boy asked why not now. Janet smiled thinly and commented that it was very fragrant. The look she gave Colleen was sharp and unmistakable, the kind of look that said, "What kind of mess are you living in?" Dennis said after dinner, firm, final. But the boy was already pushing his chair back, already halfway to the living room. And something cold and certain settled into Dennis's chest, a quiet understanding. This was it, the point of no return. He stood too fast. His chair screeched across the floor, making everyone flinch and follow the boy. The living room hit him like a wall. The smell had intensified again, impossibly stronger than it had been an hour earlier. Thick, wet. The boy froze in the doorway, gagging. Dennis grabbed his shoulder, tried to guide him back, muttering that they were taking it out tomorrow. The kid pulled away and stepped closer. Now the others were there too. Janet, her husband, Colleen, Bridget, the second boy, crowding into the room despite themselves. Windows open wide, candles burning low, and the odor wrapped around them, alive and suffocating. Janet covered her mouth, said this couldn't stay, Not in a house, not with children. Her husband swore softly. Colleen said they were taking it out tomorrow, but her voice trembled, the words barely holding together. Then the tree moved. Just a little at first, a shiver through the branches, ornaments rattling gently. Dennis told himself it was the draft, or the furnace kicking on, or his imagination finally snapping. Then it shook again. Harder. Glass exploded against the floor as ornaments dropped and shattered. Bridget screamed. Someone swore louder. Janet said there had to be something inside it, an animal trapped in the branches. A squirrel, a bird. Something alive. Colleen turned to Dennis. Her face had gone bloodless. "Get the shears," she said. "Cut it out." Dennis moved without thinking. And as he stepped closer to the tree, he felt it. Felt the air around it thicken. Felt the branches sway again. Not from wind, not from machinery, but with purpose. Like the tree had finally decided it was done waiting. Thinking, he crossed the house on instinct alone, yanked open the garage door and grabbed the largest pruning shears he owned. The heavy kind meant for limbs, not decoration. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. When he returned, everyone had retreated to the far wall. No one spoke. No one breathed normally. The tree still trembled, subtle but constant, and the stench had grown so intense that Dennis's eyes burned, tears streaming down his face without him realizing he was crying. He stepped closer. The branches were still now, but the sound remained. Deep inside the tree came a slick ripping noise like cloth being torn underwater. Slow, wet, intentional. The shears felt enormous in his grip. His heartbeat pounded so loudly, he was sure the others could hear it. He cut. The first branch came away with almost no resistance. Too easy. The wood was soft, sponge-like, leaking a thin, watery sap that ran over his knuckles. He cut another, then another. Each branch peeled back like it wanted to be removed. With every cut, the smell intensified. Behind him, someone gagged. Someone else sobbed. Dennis kept going. He had to see it, had to understand what they'd brought into their home, what he'd insisted on keeping. The tearing sound grew louder. Something inside the tree was collapsing inward. He cut away one more branch and saw something that did not belong in a living room. Something pale. His mind rejected it at first, scrambling for any explanation that wasn't the truth. Then he saw the metal, thick rods running through the trunk, embedded deep like a skeleton that didn't grow there. Reinforcement, support. As if someone had known the tree couldn't stand on its own. As if someone had planned this. Dennis cut wildly now, the shears slipping in his sweat-slick hands, branches dropping in heaps. And then it was unmistakable. A hand. Gray, swollen. Fingers curled into a stiff, unnatural shape. Not pushing out of the branches, held by them. Wrapped. Bound. The limbs of the tree had been woven deliberately around what they hid, packed tight, secured with wire that caught the blinking lights as it came into view. Dennis let the shears fall. Screaming filled the room, distant and warped, like it was happening somewhere else. He couldn't look away. Couldn't stop staring at the skin, at the fingernails still intact. Painted, red, chipped. He took a step back. The sound changed. What had been wet and tearing became a sharp, final crack. The tree lurched forward, hollowed out from the inside, rot eaten deep by heat and time, burdened by weight it was never meant to carry. The metal inside groaned once, then failed, and the tree began to fall. The tree gave one final shudder before it collapsed entirely, a wet, grotesque sound like something breaking underwater. Branches snapped with sharp cracks, ornaments shattered into glittering shards across the hardwood. Water from the stand gushed outward, pooling on the floor. And in the wreckage, finally exposed, partially freed from the insulation that had once been packed carefully around her, was a body. Once a woman. Dennis could tell that much by the shape, the jeans and sweatshirt she'd worn, the outline of what had once been human beneath the decay. Whoever had hidden her here had taken meticulous care, folding her into the hollow core, binding branches back around her with wire and twine, wrapping her in plastic to slow decomposition. The insulation had preserved her long enough to survive transport, but the heat of Dennis's home, the 72 degrees he'd insisted on keeping warm, had transformed the living room into a grim incubator. Dennis froze, staring at the horror that had been sold to him for $40. He didn't move as people fled the room. He didn't flinch when someone called 911, when Bridget's sobs filled the house, when Colleen wrapped their daughter tightly in her arms. Gary shepherded the kids out the door. Janet stayed in the entryway, her face frozen in a mask of utter disbelief, looking at Colleen as if the world had ended. Dennis remained rooted, the grotesque reality pressing in from all sides, until officers arrived, gently guiding him out of the house and onto the front lawn. Neighbors had gathered, Christmas lights sparkling cheerfully, the world oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded behind the closed doors. Much later, after statements were taken, after the body had been removed, after the tree had been dismantled and hauled away piece by piece, Dennis learned her name. Veronica Pewitt, 16 years old, missing since October, vanished while walking home from her job at Milfield Dairy Queen. The town had searched for weeks. Nobody had thought to check the discount lots, where cheap Christmas trees arrived without question, where $40 could buy a secret too terrible to imagine. The boy in the Carhartt jacket, Tyler Goss, 19, was found 3 days later. Veronica had been his girlfriend until she told him she was pregnant and intended to keep the child. In a panic, he had killed her in his car, then, overwhelmed by fear and desperation, had hidden her inside the massive tree, wiring it, insulating it, turning a symbol of holiday joy into a coffin of horror. The memory hit Dennis like a punch, sharp, cold, and relentless. It was the kind of memory that made your stomach twist, made your hands sweat even decades later. The ground that night had been frozen solid, the cruel Ohio winter wrapping the earth in unyielding ice. Burial had been impossible. He remembered the knowledge he had, the dark skills he'd once learned without imagining he'd ever need them. Hollow trunks, reinforced branches, wiring to keep a tree upright, metal rods to stabilize a corpse disguised as a festive decoration. He'd known about discount lots that asked no questions, about cousins willing to sell a tree for $20, about deals made with too little thought. Dennis had bought that tree for $40. The cost of a life had been hidden inside the needles. Time didn't stop for horror. Tyler Goss, 19, would be convicted of murder. The cousin, convicted as an accessory and for the illegal disposal of human remains. And Dennis, by then he'd already lost everything that had mattered. Colleen gone, filing for divorce. Bridget speaking only when she had to. The house on Sycamore Drive empty for months until a new owner took it. The real estate agent forced to disclose the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. Dennis had retreated into anonymity, a one-bedroom apartment on the far side of town. The kind of apartment you ended up in after every choice had failed you. Sterile, temperature-controlled, nothing personal. No decorations, no celebrations, just him and the quiet that reminded him of what he'd lost. The firm hadn't fired him, but they had exiled him, relegated him to a corner of the office where no one noticed him. He was alive, but only just. Then came December 24th, a year later. He found himself behind the wheel, driving past the old discount lot on Route 32. The chain-link gates were padlocked, plywood shelters scarred with spray paint. The lot was dead mud, dead grass, a fatting for sale sign. He drove past the last houses, past the thinning roads, into the forest where the trees pressed close like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches forming an arch overhead. And in the quiet of that road, Dennis remembered the kid. Tyler's half-smile, the way his body had relaxed when Dennis agreed to take the tree. The question that had seemed so ordinary at the time. "You sure?" Now it rang like a warning, not salesmanship, a last chance. A chance to walk away before the world turned upside down. Dennis gripped the steering wheel tighter, the past pressing against him as heavily as the branches had pressed against that hollow trunk. He could still hear the tearing, the wet crack of wood giving way, the metallic scrape of rebar under human weight. He could still smell the heat, the pine, the rot. The memory of that Christmas living room turned into a tune. And as the highway narrowed before him, lined with endless dark trees, he understood. No amount of distance could ever let him escape that night. The forest loomed, silent and accusing, and Dennis kept driving, the question lingering like frost in the winter air. Could anyone ever truly leave a horror like that behind? He thought about $40 and what that bought you in this world, what you were willing to ignore for them. Sake of a deal. He thought about Veronica Pewitt, 16 years. Old, folded into a tree and sold like cordwood. He thought about her parents, about what it meant to search for your daughter for months, only to learn she'd been displayed in someone's living room. Decorated with lights and tinsel, photographed for Instagram while she decomposed. He thought about the smell and how he'd known, had known from the start that something was wrong and kept going. Anyway, that was the thing that woke him up at night, the thing that sat in his chest. Like a stone, not that he'd bought the tree, not even that he'd kept it in his house while it rotted, but that he'd known. Some part of him had known, and he'd chosen not to. No had chosen the tree over the known, had chosen his pride and his deal and his $40 over the voice in his head that said, "Something is wrong. Here, something is very wrong." Dennis turned the car around and drove. Back to Millfield, back to his apartment, back to the life he had left. Because that was what you did. You lived with it, you carried it. You woke up every morning knowing what you'd chosen, what you'd ignored, what you'd been too proud to admit. You lived with the smell. Story 2. The car went over so quickly that Claripenton had no time to understand what was happening. One moment the road stretched ahead, white and featureless. In the blizzard, the headlights illuminating only the next few feet of tarmac. The next there was no road at all. The wheels found no purchase. The world tilted and she was falling through white air, the seat belt cutting into her chest, her hands locked on the steering wheel as if it could save her. The impact drove the breath from her lung. Metal shrieked, glass sang, shattered, then silence broken only by the tick of cooling metal in her own. Ragged breathing, she hung suspended at an angle held by the seat belt, snow pressed against the windscreen which had cracked into an intricate web but remained intact. The driver's side window had blown out entirely. Cold air poured in it. Withered snow. She could feel it melting against her face, trickling down her neck. Her left leg was wrong. She understood this before the pain arrived. When it did, it came in waves radiating up from her shin. She tried to move and couldn't. Something heavy pinned her. Foot, metal or plastic compressed in the collision. In the darkness, she couldn't. Story 2 Claripenton had no time to comprehend what was happening. 1 second the road stretched white and endless, a blizzard pressing against the headlights. The next, it vanished. Her tires found nothing, her car tipping into a yawning abyss of snow and frozen air. The seatbelt dug into her chest, locking her in place as the world twisted violently. Metal screamed. Glass shattered and sang in a high-pitched symphony. And then silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and her ragged breathing. She hung suspended at an unnatural angle, the cold from the blown-out driver's side window biting at her skin. Snow clung to her hair, melting into rivulets down her neck, and she realized her left leg was trapped. Pain came in waves, sharp and insistent, traveling up from her shin. Something heavy pinned her foot, metal, twisted plastic, the wreckage of her car claiming her body as its own. Darkness pressed in at the edges, and she could do nothing but breathe, helpless, suspended between the frozen white outside and the crushing metal that had become her prison. Clara's world had narrowed to a frozen tunnel of white. Her car lay crushed on its side, nose plunging toward a ravine she'd scoffed at hours earlier. The petrol station attendant's warning echoed in her mind. No houses. Go off the road in the storm and they won't find you till spring. She had laughed then, confident in her city-honed instincts and the solid weight of her estate car. Now, dangling in the wreckage, every ounce of that certainty had evaporated. Snow drifted across the twisted hood, settling in the gaps of shattered glass. The wind whipped at her face, prying at every seam of coat and scarf. Her phone lay dead, no signal, a cruel reminder of isolation. She tested the door, wedged tight by the frame and her own immobilized body trapped by seatbelt and mangled steel. Time stretched. Cold seeped into her bones. Panic threatened, but Clara forced herself to think. Her coat was thick, her gloves leather-lined, scarf wool. The engine's heat lingered faintly, fatting fast. A blanket in the boot, a distant promise she could not reach. Her handbag lay scattered across the crushed passenger side. Lipstick, keys, painkillers, all just beyond her grasp. Her leg throbbed in a steady, sickening rhythm. She didn't dare look directly at it, instead fixating on the snow outside. That's when she saw the figure. 10 feet away, a small child motionless, standing like a statue in the swirling blizzard. A nightgown clung to its frail frame, hair dark and wet against the white. Bare feet pressed against the snow. Clara blinked, convinced it was a trick of the wind, a mirage formed by her desperate eyes. But the child remained, unmoving, back turned as if carved from the storm itself. She croaked a call, her voice breaking in the cold, tried again, hoarse and trembling. Nothing. The child did not turn, did not acknowledge her. Clara's mind raced. Was this a hallucination, the snow playing cruel tricks, shadows bending in impossible ways? Yet every instinct screamed that this was real, that there was a presence beyond the storm's fury, silent and watching. Her heart hammered, her breath fogging the broken glass. Every second felt stretched, every gust of wind carrying both dread and disbelief. And then the child shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, but enough to remind her that the storm, the wreck, the isolation, and now this impossible figure were all converging into something far darker than mere winter weather. Clara pressed back against the steel, shivering, trapped, and watched, unable to look away as the figure waited, silent, small, and terrifyingly still, at the edge of the blizzard. Clara's breath hitched as the child moved, not fleeing, not staggering away, but gliding, encircling the car in slow, deliberate loops. Its tiny feet left nothing behind, no prints in the fresh snow, and that absence gnawed at her, With every step, the air seemed to sharpen, colder, heavier, as if winter itself had concentrated into this small, impossible being. Now it appeared on her side of the wreck, still turned away. Clara's eyes traced its fragile frame, maybe 4 or 5 years old, a nightgown so old-fashioned it looked like it had stepped out of another century. Embroidery faded at the collar, hair hanging lank and wet down its back. It paused, and her stomach nodded. Slowly, deliberately, it turned toward her. And there was nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched impossibly over where features should have been. A blank mask as cold and featureless as porcelain. Clara's heart seized. She tried to scream, but all that emerged was a tremulous whimper. The skin shifted subtly, like ripples on water, as if something stirred beneath it, pressing against its own prison. Then one small hand lifted and rapped against the broken glass. Tap, tap, tap. 3 sharp knocks, measured, patient, childlike. Clara pressed herself as far back as she could, legs screaming with pain she barely felt, trapped, frozen, every instinct shouting to run. The head tilted, unnervingly curious, and the child began its circuit again, one hand gliding along the twisted metal. Clara heard the scrape, nails or something like them, against steel, a sound that twisted in her chest. It vanished briefly behind the car, and she exhaled shakily, telling herself it was a hallucination, fever, frostbite, anything to rationalize the impossible. But the relief was short-lived. The child reappeared at the passenger side, pressing that blank, egg-like face against the window. The pale skin rippled more violently this time, and for a heartbeat, Clara could swear she glimpsed shadowed hollows where eyes might have been, forming, disappearing, as if the face remembered its own humanity and then forgot again. Her pulse thundered. The wind shrieked outside, snow whipping against the wrecked frame, but all she could see, all she could feel was that impossible figure staring back at her. And in the silence that followed, Clara knew that whatever it was, whatever it had become, it was waiting, watching, and it had already claimed this storm as its own. For a fleeting second, the hollow face tried to remember itself. Shallow impressions hinted at eyes, a mouth, a shape that almost made sense. Then everything erased itself again, leaving that smooth, dreadful blank. The child shifted closer, tapping now on the window beside Clara's head, a slow, patient rhythm, so close that the glass felt like the only thing keeping the cold from breathing on her skin. She noticed the gown then, so thin it turned nearly transparent in places, revealing the narrow outline beneath. Delicate shoulders, stick-thin arms, a body far too small to survive a night like this. The thought struck her with sick clarity. No living child could stand barefoot in this storm. Whatever stood outside had already crossed a line no warmth could reach. Nausea rolled through her. She shut her eyes, counting breaths, begging the image to dissolve. When she looked again, it hadn't moved. The tapping continued, precise and unhurried. She must have whimpered because the sound stopped. The head angled slightly, as if the thing were listening. Then it stepped back into the snow and faced her again, motionless, watching in whatever way something without eyes could watch. The wind screamed through the ravine, hurling snow hard enough to rattle the car. Drifts built up along the doors. The child didn't sway, didn't flinch. It stood untouched by the storm, a still point in a world coming apart. Clara's hands trembled violently as she clutched the wheel, grounding herself in the cold certainty of metal. Time unraveled. Minutes or hours slipped by without shape. The chill crept deeper, gnawing into her bones. Below her knee, her injured leg went eerily quiet, the pain fatting into a frightening numbness. She worked her fingers inside her gloves, but they felt swollen, slow, no longer fully hers. The child began moving again. It traced a perfect circle around the wreck, never speeding up, never slowing down, always the same distance. Each loop ended at the front of the car, where it paused and knocked 3 times before continuing. The sound carved itself into her thoughts. Knock, knock, knock. A clock without hands. She caught herself waiting for it, bracing for the knocks before they came. The pattern repeated until numbers lost meaning. She searched her memory for explanations, myths, stories, anything. She'd never believed in spirits, never believed in signs. That was her mother's world, full of whispered warnings and half-remembered folklore. But trapped in the dark, counting the knocks of a faceless child in the snow, belief no longer felt like a choice. The wind clawed at the car like sharp fingers, snow lashing against the shattered windows, freezing every exposed inch of her skin. Clara's chest rose and fell in ragged puffs, each breath visible, fragile in the bitter night. Her toes were gone to numbness, her trapped leg a distant, dull throb that throbbed with its own sinister rhythm. Exhaustion tugged at her eyelids, heavy and insistent, tempting her to give in. Just a moment, she thought, just a blink. And then the scream tore through the darkness. High, piercing, impossible. A child's scream raw with terror, rage, and something darker, something hollow that seemed to suck at her very core. Clara's eyes snapped open, heart hammering, every nerve screaming. But the scream wasn't just a sound, it was a siphon. Heat drained from her chest, warmth leached away as if the blizzard itself had taken form and found her inside this twisted metal cage. The figure pressed against the windscreen. Now she could see the mouth, or what passed for one. The smooth, blank face split open along a jagged line, a dark gash that pulsed with sound. Screaming. Edges of the wound wriggled like living things, trying desperately to form lips and teeth, to mimic the human, but failing. And then, just as suddenly, it sealed itself, leaving pale, featureless skin where the horror had erupted. Clara shivered violently, not from the cold, but from the void that lingered in her chest. Something vital had been drawn away, and she felt weaker, emptier. It wasn't the blizzard that threatened her, it was this presence. Every scream, every unnatural sound siphoned her sanity, her awareness, leaving her raw and hollow. Was it punishing her, feeding on her, or saving her in some grotesque, impossible way? The thought twisted in her mind, but she forced herself to focus, to stay awake, to notice every detail, anything to hold the emptiness at bay. The child's gown was strange and archaic, a whisper from another century. Thin, fragile fabric, worn and nearly transparent, clinging to the narrow frame beneath. Ribs showed faintly, a fragile spine, the faint rise and fall of a chest that should not have lived, or at least not here in this storm. It moved with purpose, circling, patient and relentless, hands brushing the metal, tapping on the glass in a slow, steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound became a heartbeat, a warning, a countdown. Clara's mind fought to grasp reality. She counted the taps, the circuits of the figure, tried to anchor herself in the here and now. But the hollow face, the thin body, the way it stole warmth from her very soul, none of it made sense. She remembered stories, whispers from explorers and mountaineers, spirits and phantoms in extreme cold. But this was different. This was not a tale told around fires. This was raw, immediate, and it was here. She could not close her eyes again. She could not sleep. Every inch of her screamed to move, but she was trapped, pinned, exposed. She forced herself to track it, every motion, every tap, every invisible footprint in the snow. And in that relentless watching, a strange clarity came. Survival was not just about fighting the cold, but resisting the hunger of this thing, the slow theft of her essence. Hours or minutes, time had no weight here, slipped past. The wind roared, the snow stung, her body numb, but she remained, eyes fixed, heart taut. The child circled once more, paused at the windscreen and tapped. Tap, tap, tap. each knock a pulse, a measure of the impossible patience of this presence. And Clara, trembling, exhausted, terrified, understood. This was no random visitation. It had a purpose, a reason, and it had chosen her. In the storm, in the snow, in the frozen ravine, Clara stayed awake. Eyes wide, mind sharp, every nerve straining. She did not move. She did not speak. She survived moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat, keeping herself tethered to the fragile thread between life and whatever darkness had come to watch her that night. Clara's thoughts drifted, unbidden, to her mother's house, the one she'd fled just hours ago. The memory clawed at her mind, sharp and cold. The nursery on the second floor, always locked, always silent. Her mother had said it was ready if ever needed, though it never had been. She shook her head, trying to dislodge it. This was no time for memories. Survival demanded attention. She had to stay awake, stay warm, cling to consciousness until help arrived. Surely someone would notice. Someone would come looking. But who? She had left quietly, unannounced. Her colleagues assumed she was still away. Her mother would not call until her expected arrival. Days could pass before anyone realized she was missing. The truth sank into her chest like ice. She was utterly alone. Only the faceless child remained, its pale form pressed against the passenger side window, silent now, watching. Its circling had ceased, its tap silenced. Fear no longer coursed through her veins. Exhaustion had burned it away, leaving a hollow, numbed ache. If this thing had meant to kill her, surely it would have done so by now. And yet it lingered, patient and inscrutable. What did it want? Clara searched her mind for answers. In stories, spirits sought vengeance, closure, unfinished business. But she had lived quietly, harmed no one, carried no dark secrets, or so she believed. Yet as the question settled, uninvited, a long-buried memory surfaced, trembling at the edges of her consciousness. 3 years ago, sterile white walls, the quiet hum of machines, a doctor's measured voice, the word miscarriage. She remembered the cramping, the blood, the sensation of something vital vanishing, leaving behind only the faint impression of what had been. At the time, she had not wanted the child, young, unprepared, terrified of motherhood. When it ended at 12 weeks, part of her had felt relief, a complex, guilty relief, intertwined with grief. She had never spoken of it, not to her mother, not to anyone. She had returned to her life, carrying that secret alone, folding it neatly into the quiet corners of herself. Now trapped in the wrecked car, snow piling against the windows, the child outside seemed to embody that memory, that hidden void. It stood, unblinking, faceless, and still. Perhaps it had always been waiting for her to face the emptiness she carried, the guilt she refused to name. The storm pressed in, cold and merciless, but Clara realized she no longer trembled from fear alone. She trembled from recognition, from the weight of what she had tried to bury, now reflected in the silent, watching presence outside. Her breaths came shallow, deliberate, each puff of air visible in the frozen cabin. The child remained patient, a sentinel in the blizzard, a reminder that some voids cannot be ignored, that some truths will always follow. And in that quiet, frozen confrontation, Clara understood. Survival was no longer just a matter of warmth or movement. Survival meant acknowledgement. Survival meant looking into the face of what she had tried to forget, faceless or not, and refusing to look away. She left the hospital and stitched herself back into the shape of her old life, sealing that night away like a box pushed to the far back of a closet. She never opened it. She never asked questions she was afraid to answer. But now, trapped in the frozen dark, one question slipped through the cracks. Had it been a girl? The doctor had said it was impossible to know. Too soon, too early. And yet Clara had felt it in her bones with a certainty that needed no proof. A daughter. Not a child who ever breathed or cried, not one who opened her eyes to the world, but still a daughter. A fragile spark that existed only briefly, then vanished. Her gaze drifted back to the figure outside the car. The child was moving again, gliding through the snow in a slow, deliberate circle. The thin nightgown fluttered in the wind. Bare feet pressed into the white ground without leaving a single print, as if the earth refused to acknowledge her presence. The thought crept in, unwelcome and impossible. No, that couldn't be right. What she had lost had never truly lived. It had been potential, possibility, a beginning that never reached a middle. It couldn't become this, couldn't walk, couldn't knock, couldn't scream into the night. That wasn't how reality worked. Then again, she hadn't believed in anything like this before tonight either. The child completed another loop around the car. Tap, tap, tap. The sound settled into a pattern, steady and almost gentle, predictable. Clara's eyelids drooped despite herself, her body betraying her will. Just a moment, she thought. Just a second of rest. The scream shattered the silence. Clara jolted awake, heart slamming against her ribs. This time she opened her eyes before the sound peaked, before it fully tore through the air. The child was inches from the windshield, smooth, blank face pressed to the fractured glass. For a heartbeat, something changed. The surface of its face shifted, as if memories were trying to push through skin that refused to shape itself. Hollows where eyes should be, a faint curve suggesting a mouth, not fully formed, just enough to be recognized. Then it stepped back. The face erased itself, perfectly empty once more. Clara's breath shook. It didn't want her to sleep, that much was clear. Her thoughts crawled forward, slowed by cold and exhaustion. Sleep was dangerous, she knew that. People drifted off and never woke up in conditions like this. But how could it know? How could something like that understand hypothermia, understand death in that way? Unless it wasn't trying to harm her at all. The idea felt foolish, almost laughable, but it wouldn't leave her mind. The child had never touched the car, never tried to force its way inside, never reached for her. It only circled, it only knocked, and every time her eyes closed, it screamed her back to consciousness, keeping her awake, keeping her alive. Why would something like this care? She thought again of the hospital room, the quiet hum, the words spoken softly, professionally. She remembered the moment she understood that something had ended before it ever truly began. Had it known, even in that earliest state, had it felt itself slipping away? And worse, did it know how she had felt afterward? The relief she had never admitted out loud, the shame that followed it like a shadow, the nights she lay awake wondering what kind of person feels gratitude when a life disappears. She had told herself she wasn't responsible, she couldn't control what happened, but the relief, that was hers, and she had carried it in silence ever since. Maybe the child knew all of it. Maybe it had always known. And now, drawn to her fear and isolation, it had come not to take revenge, not to punish, but to witness, to keep her awake through the cold the same way it had endured its own ending, to stand watch as she fought to survive the night. Outside, the child began another slow circuit around the car. Tap, tap, tap. And Clara understood, with a chill deeper than the snowstorm, that whatever stood beside her wasn't waiting for her to die. It was waiting to see whether she chose to live. The storm pressed closer, wind clawing at the car, snow piling against the sides like a silent army. The child circled relentlessly, each pass accompanied by that strange, piercing scream whenever Clara dared to drift toward sleep. It wasn't hunting her, it was forcing her awake, keeping her tethered to the world she was so close to slipping from. If it wanted her dead, she would have already been nothing more than frozen stillness in the wreckage. Her head throbbed, thoughts tangled into icy knots. The cold had sunk deep, gnawing at her chest, stealing clarity. Danger was real. Urgency pressed down, yet the specifics of what she had to do slipped away, dissolving like snow melting on bare skin. Then it appeared again at the shattered window, palm pressed flat against the glass. Clara froze, mesmerized, tiny, delicate, impossibly perfect. She lifted her gloved hand, matching it against the child. For a heartbeat, they mirrored each other, separated only by a fragile pane of cracked glass. And then she felt it, that impossible pull, a siphoning force that made her chest tighten and her blood hum. She yanked her hand back with a gasp, heart hammering. The child tilted its head, curious, observing, then resumed its slow, relentless circuit. Her tears fell, icy rivulets down her cheeks, freezing almost before they landed. She didn't know if she wept for herself, for the child, or for the daughter she had never held. Grief, fear, and regret melded into a single crushing weight. Time lost all meaning. She blinked and the child had moved. Blinked again and it had completed another pass. The storm roared on, indifferent, snow piling relentlessly higher against the car. How long had she been trapped here? Hours, years. Her mind drifted back, unwanted but inescapable. Her mother had known. 3 days after the miscarriage, she had come unannounced. She hadn't asked questions, hadn't spoken of what happened, only stayed, quiet, present, tending to the house, letting Clara breathe in silence. When she left, she had said just one thing: grief has its own time. Clara had thanked her then, had filed it away with all the other memories she wasn't ready to feel. But now, staring at the faceless child outside her car, circling with inexorable patience, she understood. Grief did have its own time. Patient, silent, waiting until the moment you could no longer avoid it. Until it could press against the fragile barrier separating you from reality itself. She had never truly mourned. She had locked it away. But now, in the frozen storm, grief was here, embodied in something spectral and unyielding, forcing her to confront what she had buried for so long. The wind screamed through the ravine like a living thing, whipping snow into Clara's car, coating her in white frost. Her fingers ached inside their gloves, her leg throbbed from the wreck, but the cold wasn't the worst part. Something outside kept her tethered to the fragile thread of consciousness, the child, or whatever it had become. Its presence was relentless, circling, tapping, screaming whenever her eyelids drooped. Clara's mind wavered. The exhaustion and the cold pressed against her skull like iron bands. It would have been so easy to close her eyes, to surrender to the darkness gnawing at her bones. She felt herself slipping, untethered, weightless, as if her very substance was dissolving into the frozen night. And then the scream came, sharp, raw, unbearable, and she didn't move at first. It was different this time. Not just terror, not just anger. It carried longing, a desperate ache that seemed almost human. Her eyes flew open. The child stood at the windscreen, hands pressed against the cracked glass, its face split by that impossible gash. The scream poured forth, a sound that stole warmth and energy from her, siphoning it as if her very life was being drained. But beneath the horror, a strange awareness flickered. The scream wasn't only taking, it was giving. The cold that had seeped into her chest, the numbness threatening to claim her, was countered by a thread of vitality, fragile and shivering, flowing back through the barrier of glass. Clara's breath came in ragged clouds. Her heart pounded and she realized with a sudden shivering clarity what had been impossible before. The child wasn't trying to kill her. It wasn't punishing her. It was keeping her alive. Every tap, every circuit, every scream was a lifeline, a tether to consciousness, to warmth, to the world of the living. The exchange was brutal, unrelenting, but it was necessary. The child fed on her awareness, and in return, it returned enough to keep her heartbeat steady, her lungs drawing breath against the merciless cold. And then the truth settled in her chest like ice and fire together. This faceless, impossible figure was the daughter she had never held, the life she had lost before it even began. The one who had existed only in potential, only in secret, only in memory. Yet somehow, impossibly, she had returned. Not as Clara had imagined, not as flesh and bone, but as this spectral, relentless presence. Her daughter had come for her, tethered to her grief and her survival, and the realization struck Clara with the weight of a storm. She was not alone. Not here, not now. Not while the child's screams, tapping, and circling kept her alive in a frozen world that would have otherwise swallowed her whole. The realization broke something open in Clara, and she laughed, a fractured sound that collapsed into tears halfway out of her chest. The idea was impossible and yet achingly right. All this time she had buried her sorrow, sealed it away like a shameful secret. And now that unspoken grief had taken shape, standing barefoot in the snow, fighting with everything it had to keep her alive. Her daughter stepped back from the car. The screaming stopped. Silence settled, thick and fragile. In the pale light of the storm, the small figure looked unbearably alone, and Clara understood why the face was blank. She had never seen her child, never held her, never traced the curve of a cheek or memorized a smile. There were no features to remember, only absence. So absence was what remained. Clara lifted her hand and pressed it to the glass. After a pause, the child mirrored her, palm meeting palm through the cracked barrier. The simple symmetry undid her. They stayed that way for a long moment, mother and daughter divided by cold and glass and time. When the child began to walk again, it no longer felt like menace. It was watchfulness, a vigil, a small figure packing the perimeter of the car, standing guard against the dark. Whenever Clara's head sagged, whenever sleep tried to claim her, the scream returned, not cruel now, but urgent, pulling her back from the edge. And each time Clara forced her eyes open, she whispered into the freezing air. She spoke of everything, the fear, the loss, the relief she had hated herself for, the guilt she had carried in silence, the years of pretending nothing had ever happened. Her words tangled and broke apart, spilling out without order or grace. The child listened, or seemed to. As it circled, something in its presence softened, as if being named, finally acknowledged, had given it weight. The night dragged on. The storm weakened in slow stages, the wind surrendering to scattered gusts. Snow still fell, but gently now. Clara's leg was gone to her, numb and distant. Her hands barely obeyed her. Frost crept along the inside of the windshield, tracing the edges of her breath. Her awareness flickered. Sometimes the child was close, sometimes far. Sometimes there seemed to be many of them, pale shapes moving in unison before collapsing back into one small center. At one point, she thought she heard her mother calling her name. When she focused, there was nothing, only the hush of falling snow and the steady presence outside. The cold stopped hurting. That frightened the last clear part of her mind. She knew what it meant. Her body was letting go. But still the child remained, circling, waiting, watching, refusing to let the darkness take her quietly. The cold was stealing her piece by piece, creeping from her fingers and toes inward, leaving her core barely alive. She could feel herself slipping, losing grip on the world, while outside the storm raged as if it had a personal vendetta. And the child, her impossible, faceless daughter, knew. Its pace had quickened, frantic and insistent. The tapping against the glass had become a chaotic staccato, the screams erupting before Clara could even blink. Each cry yanked her back from the edge, but the effort to stay conscious was growing heavier, more punishing. Her body was surrendering to frostbite, exhaustion, and time. She wondered, with a stab of helplessness, what would happen to this little wraith if she failed. Would it continue its vigil alone, packing the perimeter of a lifeless car, screaming into the void of the empty ravine? That thought tore at her heart, sharper than any cold or pain. She tried to speak, to tell it to leave, to find rest elsewhere, but her throat betrayed her. Just incoherent murmurs came out, thick and wet in her mouth. The child pressed itself flat against the windshield, and for a fleeting instant the impossible happened. The blank expanse of its face rippled violently, eye sockets hollow. A delicate nose took shape, a tiny mouth opened, weeping. Clara gasped, tears freezing against her cheeks, and for a heartbeat she saw her daughter as she might have been, the features that had never formed, the life never lived. Then the face dissolved back into smooth, unbroken nothingness. A terror unlike any other settled in her chest. Her daughter existed at the edge of reality, almost, but never fully, never entirely. The scream came again, shrill and rising like a siren, ripping through the stillness of the snow. Clara felt herself draining, her strength siphoned in a slow, intimate theft. And suddenly she understood the terrible bargain. To survive, she had to give something. Her warmth, her life, her energy, to this child, both monster and protector. To be saved, she had to let herself be consumed. Then through the chaos of cold and screaming, a new sound penetrated. A low, steady rumble. A motor. A human voice calling faintly through the snow. At first she thought her mind had conjured it, another hallucination. But it grew louder, closer, and then the beams of headlights sliced through the gray, wild blizzard, offering light, warmth, salvation. The child stepped back, tilting its head toward the approaching figures, the light, the hope. Then, slowly, it turned back to Clara, a final glance that carried understanding, warning, love, and grief all at once. She realized the vigil was over, rescue had come. And as the first figures emerged from the snow, calling her name, Clara felt a shiver, not from the cold, not from the fear, but from the profound, impossible, and terrible beauty of being kept alive by something that had never been fully alive to begin with. The child lingered a moment longer, circling once more, then vanished into the storm, leaving behind the memory of its presence, the echo of its scream, and a warmth that would never leave her heart. Never imagined she would see beauty again after so many hours of cold and terror. Her eyes scanned the ravine, searching desperately for the pale figure that had guarded her through the night. The child was still there, just at the edge of the rising sun's glow, small and fragile, almost ethereal. And then, gradually, she began to fade, dissolving into the morning light like a memory being gently returned to the world it had never fully inhabited. Clara's chest tightened with a mix of grief and awe. She had been kept alive by something that should not have existed, something that had carried the weight of both loss and love. Her daughter's presence had been a strange, impossible tether, keeping her conscious through the endless dark hours. And now, as the warmth of the ambulance began to seep into her frozen limbs, she understood. The vigil had ended, and her daughter could finally rest. The paramedics worked around her, voices calm and focused, their movements precise and caring. They murmured instructions, reassured her, wrapped her tightly in blankets, and slowly freed her trapped leg. Pain shot through her, but she barely noticed, her mind still half occupied with the fatting figure outside. They lifted her carefully, supporting her weight, guiding her toward the waiting vehicle. Clara's eyes never left the ravine, searching for one last glimpse. As she was placed onto the gurney, the first true rays of dawn spilled across the snow, painting the world in gold and soft pinks. The storm had passed. The night's horrors, the screams, the terror and draining cold, they were all behind her now. She allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in hours, feeling warmth creep back into her limbs, life returning to her veins. And in that fragile, perfect light, Clara whispered a silent, trembling farewell. To the daughter she had never held, to the presence that had watched over her, that had kept her alive in a world where hope had seemed impossible. The figure was gone, but its gift remained. Her survival, her breath, and the understanding that love, even lost and unformed, could reach across the impossible and hold her in the dark until dawn. Clara closed her eyes, letting the ambulance carry her into safety, into warmth, into life. And for the first time since the storm began, she felt the quiet, steady heartbeat of hope. Clara hadn't realized how painfully beautiful the world could look in morning light. The snow glistened like crushed glass, the sky softening from gray to pale gold. At the edge of her vision, almost disappearing into the glow, the child lingered, her daughter, small and silent, still watching. Clara weakly lifted a hand. A faint, trembling wave returned from the figure before it dissolved completely, vanishing like smoke caught in the breeze. "Wait, please, wait." Clara's lips moved, but no sound came. Her apologies, her sorrow, her longing, all trapped in her chest. It was too late. The child was gone, leaving behind only the silent, empty ravine, pristine and white. The ambulance doors thudded shut. The engine rumbled to life, carrying her away from the frozen world that had held her hostage through night and terror. Warmth crept back into Clara's body, slow and relentless. No scream pierced the air, no frigid fingers tugged at her consciousness. She was alive. Against every imaginable odds, she had survived. And the tears came, hot, unstoppable, racking sobs that shook her frozen form. The paramedics exchanged quiet, concerned glances, one squeezing her hand gently, offering a silent comfort. But Clara's tears were not for herself. They were for the child she had never held, the daughter that had never drawn breath, and for the years she had buried her grief in silence. She wept for the impossible gift she had been given, salvation delivered by the very life she had once failed to save. And in that moment, a truth sank in, steady and unyielding. Grief has its own time, its own shape. Sometimes it defies logic, defies explanation, manifesting as something both terrible and beautiful. A faceless child standing vigil in the snow, refusing to let the living be claimed by death. The ambulance moved steadily forward. Clara closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engine and the gentle warmth fill her senses. In her mind, she could still see her daughter, faint and distant, alone in the ravine, tethered to the sorrow Clara had never confronted. Her child had saved her, but now she remained behind, bound to the emptiness left by unspoken grief, a silent guardian left in the snow. Clara opened her eyes. Through the small rear window, the gray tarmac stretched behind them, cutting through a world of white. The ravine, the storm, the impossible vigil. It was disappearing with every mile, fading into memory. And though the figure was gone, its presence lingered in her heart, a reminder of love, of loss, and of the fragile, luminous bond that had kept her alive through the longest night of her life. Clara felt the weight of the morning pressing in as the ambulance sped along the thawing road. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, etched into her bones and her mind. She knew with a quiet certainty that her daughter was still there, somewhere in that endless snow, waiting, watching, a silent sentinel that would never rest. The thought brought tears that weren't of relief, but of recognition. The child had given her more than survival. She had given Clara the truth of her own grief, the acknowledgement of what she had buried for so long. It wasn't just the rescue that mattered. It was understanding, finally, what had been lost. The weight of that realization pressed down on her chest, sharp and tender at once. Her daughter had fought through impossible cold, through an endless night of silence and wind to keep her alive. And Clara now carried the debt, the memory, the love that had been poured out in that snow-filled ravine. Every breath she took was tethered to that faceless figure, circling, vigilant, unyielding. She would live. She had to live, worthy of the sacrifice, carrying the imprint of that lonely, patient devotion with her. As the ambulance turned onto a more familiar road, the signs of civilization began to pierce the horizon. Power lines, distant buildings, the subtle hum of normal life creeping back in. The world outside seemed ordinary, indifferent, moving on as if nothing had occurred. But Clara knew better. Something extraordinary had taken place in that frozen hollow. Something impossible, terrifying, and achingly beautiful. Her daughter had arrived for her in the black of night when no one else could, standing watch against the creeping silence of death. And when the rescue finally arrived, when the moment of duty was fulfilled, she had remained behind, bound to the snow and the night, tethered to a grief she had never been allowed to leave. Clara pressed her hand against the ambulance window, tracing the cold glass as if it could reach across the miles. Somewhere behind her in that empty ravine, her daughter's hand pressed back against the void, a mirrored gesture of love, of sacrifice, of presence that defied reality. Around her, the paramedic's voice cut through the haze, asking about pain, allergies, next of kin. She answered automatically, providing names, numbers, affirming the obvious. She would need surgery. She was hypothermic. She was alive. "Yes, I understand," she said, but the words felt hollow. "Lucky," someone murmured. The word echoed inside her skull, grotesque in its simplicity. There had been no luck here, only love and loss, endurance and the unbearable cost of survival. In the hospital, the warmth was almost shocking after the frozen ravine. The corridors gleamed under bright lights. Machines hummed their steady reassurance, and skilled hands moved around her with purpose and precision. Her leg was examined, her pain treated, injections administered. Yet through it all, Clara felt removed, suspended, somewhere between the living world and the memory of that night. Her eyes lingered on the sterile walls, the bright white, and she could still see the snow, the endless circling, the faceless figure etched into her mind. The world had returned to ordinary, but she had crossed a threshold no one else could see. Somewhere out there, tethered to grief and devotion, her daughter remained, a quiet guardian in the snow, a witness to love beyond life, holding vigil for the mother who had finally learned to grieve. And in that knowledge, Clara understood the terrible, luminous truth. She had been saved not by luck, but by the relentless, unshakable love of the child she had never held. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm air, a strange comfort after the frozen terror of the night before. Clara's body was alive, tended to, repaired, but a part of her mind remained frozen in that ravine, locked with the faceless child who had refused to leave. Surgery had stitched her wounds, set the shattered bones in her leg, but it couldn't stitch away the memory, the presence that had kept her breathing through the endless darkness. When she woke, haze and grogginess clinging to her like cobwebs, her mother sat quietly beside the bed. Her face looked older, more lined than Clara remembered, but there was a steady calm in her eyes. Without a word, she reached out and held Clara's hand. Silence stretched between them for a long, fragile moment. Then Clara's voice broke through, thick with lingering medication and unspent tears. She was there all night. Every time I tried to sleep, she screamed to wake me. She saved me. Her mother's hand tightened around hers, a quiet affirmation. "I know," she said softly. And in that simple acknowledgement, Clara felt the depth of understanding that had always lain beneath her mother's composed exterior. A knowledge that grief could take forms, that love didn't vanish with death, that the boundary between life and what lay beyond was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. "I can't go back for her," Clara whispered, voice small, weighed down by sorrow. "She's still there and I can't." "No," her mother agreed gently, "you can't." The truth landed like a blow. To survive by the will of love, only to leave that same love behind. To carry the life she had been given while the one who had given it remained trapped in a frozen vigil. "She'll always be there," her mother added, not as comfort but as fact. And Clara closed her eyes, seeing it so vividly. The snow, the empty car, the pale, circling figure, endless and patient, keeping watch for a mother who had escaped the night but could never return to that moment. 5 days passed in the hospital. 2 surgeries, pins and plates, hours of physical therapy. They assured her she would walk again, though perhaps with a limp. Remarkably lucky, they said. Another hour in that cold and she would have been gone. But Clara had been granted more than an hour. She had survived an entire night, kept alive by a faceless child who refused to let her go. On the day of her discharge, she asked her mother to drive past the ravine to see it in the clarity of daylight. Her mother said nothing, just helped her into the car, a rental since her own vehicle still lay trapped below, waiting for recovery. The road wound north, silence filling the space between them. Soon, signs of danger appeared, yellow tape, warnings about the unstable roadside. Her mother stopped at a safe distance. Clara shifted onto her crutches, legs trembling, and made her way to the edge. The ravine looked different in the light of day, smaller, quieter, less monstrous. The snow was no longer a blinding storm, just a pale blanket stretching into the distance. And there, in the corner of her vision, she could almost feel it, the presence, a reminder that what had kept her alive was gone now, yet forever embedded in the stark beauty of that place. The ravine stretched below, a jagged cut in the earth, snow settling in every crevice, the car still lying on its side, half buried in ice and stone. Recovery crews would claim it eventually, but for now it was just a frozen monument to the night's terror. Clara scanned the pale slope, searching for any sign of her daughter, but there was nothing. Only snow, rock, and the silent wreckage. Of course there was nothing. It was daylight and she was alive. The child appeared only to those teetering on the edge, to those whose life hung in balance. Yet as Clara leaned on her crutches, the winter air biting at her cheeks, she felt it, light as a whisper, impossibly close, watching. She whispered into the wind, "Thank you." The words felt tiny, almost laughably inadequate compared to the weight of the gift she had been given, but they were all she had. She lingered, letting the cold air fill her lungs until her mother gently touched her arm, a quiet reminder that she needed to rest, that her body still demanded care. Clara nodded and allowed herself to be guided back to the car. As they drove away, the ravine shrank in the rearview mirror, a scar etched into the white landscape. Somewhere in that scar, invisible and alone, her daughter remained, keeping watch, patient and eternal. Clara turned forward, bracing against the pain in her leg, the ache in her body, but alive. Alive because someone had refused to let her go. She glanced at the mirror one last time. And there she was, just for a heartbeat, a small figure in a thin nightgown, the smooth, blank face turned toward her. In that featureless face, Clara saw the faintest trace of intent, lips forming, eyes reaching out, desperate to see, to speak. And then she was gone. Clara's hands clenched the armrest. Her mother continued driving, unaware, chatting quietly about the hospital recovery timelines, the things Clara would need at home. But Clara knew better. The child wasn't just in the ravine anymore, or perhaps she always was, bound to that frozen place. But now she was also here, riding silently with her, a presence pressing cold and weightless against her spine in quiet moments, a tether between life and loss, a bond forged in terror and survival. Every inexplicable chill, every sudden wave of fatigue, every pull at her core, the subtle drain of energy was a reminder. Her daughter was still with her, still watching, still guarding. A ghost and a mother, intertwined in a fragile, haunting symbiosis that would endure for as long as Clara lived. The saving had left a mark, permanent and invisible, a whisper of devotion that no distance or daylight could erase. The wind had stopped howling, the snow settling into silence. But Clara felt its echo in her bones, a lingering chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She realized with a shock that knotted her stomach that the greatest terror she had faced wasn't the blizzard or the jagged ravine or even the faceless child that had circled her through the long night. No, it was this, understanding that being saved came at a price she would carry for the rest of her life. Her daughter had come for her, yes, but not without leaving a mark deeper than any wound, deeper than frostbite or broken bones. Love, Clara thought, could be as dangerous as any storm. Her daughter, the child who had never breathed, never drawn a name into the world, was now her savior, her sentinel, her shadow. A presence invisible to everyone else but tangible to Clara, pressing and pulling, sustaining her life while quietly feeding on it in return. Clara didn't glance at the mirror. She stared straight ahead at the road, the mundane landscape unrolling like a lie, ordinary and safe, as if nothing had happened. But she felt it behind her, patient, unyielding, impossibly present. That weight, that cold, quiet attention would accompany her every step, every heartbeat, every long night she tried to sleep. It would wait, always wait. And a thought crossed her mind that made her chest tight. When her own end came, whether decades or years from now, would her daughter finally be free? Or would they remain entwined in that same endless orbit, feeding and being fed, bound together by a love so fierce it could neither release nor relent? Clara pressed her hand against the warm car window. Somewhere just behind her, unseen in the bright morning, a small, pale hand pressed back. And in that simple gesture, she understood everything. The impossible gift, the unbearable price, the eternal bond. They were together now, forever.